Okay, just a heads up, this one may be longer because there's a lot of things I feel need to be covered. So I made a video when Salman Rushdie was attacked in New York City um shortly after it happened because I wanted to discuss the issue as it was fresh. The good news is that he seems to be rebounded. He's talking again. He's joking with family members. I think it's one of the great Stoic values of um, brave intellectuals is that they have that sense of humor. Um, so that's a good news, but he could, still will have life-changing injuries. He might lose an eye. I don't know if it's enough to make him blind, but hopefully the injuries will be less severe than they could have been. The attacker himself said he was surprised that Rushdie survived. Of course, he's saying he never intended to kill him, which is just like it's almost like I feel fanatics like that are almost outside of themselves. They almost can't, and this is no excuse, but almost like after the fact, they almost detach themselves from responsibility. Um, but I've long felt this is about much more than Rushdie. Now, there are some ironies in the attack on Rushdie. Copies of the Satanic Verses and his other works have apparently once again been in high demand on Amazon. Bookstores are sold out. Um, so this is the great irony. Those who hate Rushdie, they see him as blasphemous and a threat to Islam. With this sort of attack, all they have, all they've done is galvanize his thoughts. The great irony is, from their perspective, if their whole idea is to silence him, it's had the exact opposite effect. And if he had passed away, I think it would be an even bigger effect. He would be a martyr of free speech. Um, Now, the obvious counter here is to their attitude is they can simply not buy the books. They can disagree with him. They can feel he's not a great writer. But that would be asking too much when we're talking about the hypersensitivity that is within Islam. It would be asking too much. I think the real danger here is certainly the hypersensitivity. Combine that with the ideology of pan-Islamist supremacy. And actually, it is a supremacist movement. It's part of this that is often overlooked. It's actually a supremacist movement. In a sense, is not that different from white supremacy or black supremacy or any other supremacist movement, except it's not so much race based. It's this idea that Islamists believe they are superior to non Muslims. Now, that supremacy needs to be called out a lot more. Um, I think the reason the attack on Russia's got so much attention is because, perhaps people come complacent who followed the story like, well, it was 33 years ago, it kind of faded with time. But the fact is, as recently as 2019, Iran had reissued its fatwa, as I understand it. Now, of course, Iran's denying any responsibility, but Iranian state mouthpiece newspapers are celebrating the attack. They're calling on the dignified citizen who took action, or the dignified Muslim who took action against the dangerous apostate Rushdie. Interviews on the streets of Tehran have been mixed. Some people have expressed concerns because there might be an increase in sanctions. I don't think that's going to happen actually. But others have celebrated it. Oh, they've got him. That's great. But it makes you question. Firstly, they're giving a lot of credit, ironically, to Rushdie because they're saying this one man, the 75-year-old writer, has such power that he can inflame and infuriate a religion of 1.6 billion people. That's actually giving Rushdie a lot of credit when you think about it. Um, no, I'm not going to speak about Rushdie as a writer because honestly, I haven't read his work. Some have said it's quite hard to follow. It's a bit dull even. But quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if his prose is fantastic. I mean, he is a celebrated author. He has won numerous awards. Um, But it doesn't really matter if the prose is great, if it's great writing, or if it's tripe. It doesn't really matter. The principle matters. I mean, I actually think the Charlie Hebdo cartoons are not great quality. I've seen much better animation, and some of their stuff was quite schoolyardish. But again, as soon as they were attacked by violent Islamists, they were martyrs of free speech. And this is what Islamists don't seem to grasp. Every time they lash out, they only weaken their own cause. But this goes much deeper than Salman Rushdie actually. Although Rushdie is probably the most high-profile victim of Islamic extremism, although there's others like Ayan Hirsi Ali. Um, I think that it's really just a symptom of a much bigger problem. I mean, consider the thousands of anonymous Nigerians who've been slaughtered by Boko Haram, and it does go into the thousands. Now, people might say there's a long-standing history of ethnic tensions between the Muslim north and the Christian south in Nigeria, and yes, there's been sporadic religious violence there, in which Muslims have also been killed, but Boko Haram is just an archetypal savage Islamist terror group, and they have caused. Um, at one point, it was thought that they'd killed even more people than ISIS. I mean, they've spread terror beyond Nigeria's borders into Cameroon, Chad, Mali, pretty much branching out across West Africa. Al Shabaab in Somalia. The Taliban regime once again in power in Afghanistan. Of course, all the words about changing was hollow. They were beating women protesters recently. Um, consider consider what we've seen in the West: the Islamist attacks in Manchester and Paris. Of course, the big example, 9/11. Um, but consider the smaller scale stuff. Consider Samuel Paty beheaded in France. Consider the teacher who wasn't named but who went into hiding near Leeds. And both Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer failed to condemn it, which was pathetic. Um, consider the fact that Christians have been slaughtered in their own places of worship. Coptic Christians in Egypt, um, the Easter Sunday massacre in Sri Lanka in 2019. That happened the same year as the Christchurch mosque attack. But whilst there was, waves of condemnation across the Islamic world about what happened in New Zealand, there was muted responses about the even bigger atrocity that had happened in Sri Lanka. Um, but this isn't a case of it's a competition to see whether far right extremists or Islamist extremists are have a higher body count. The answer there is obvious. It's by far, the Islamists. If you actually if you actually break this down and look at the sort of attacks that have been attributed to far right extremists, there are some big ones. There's the Norway attacks of 2011. There is the New Zealand attacks, and there's some others. But it probably goes into hundreds of people. If you look at the number of people killed, wounded by Islamists, it goes into many thousands. There's no comparison. The situation of Muslims in the West, again, is not comparable. There was an Islamist on a forum I was looking at who was defending countries that have severe blasphemy laws, and he was saying their countries, their laws. Saudi Arabia has just imposed a barbaric sentence on a young woman for apparently using Twitter, which wasn't necessarily a blasphemy thing, but it just shows how savage the human rights situation still is there. Joshua Usyk last night was held there, and some said it shouldn't have been. But this video is not about that. So he said, well, it's their country, their laws, and I put it to him, okay, so by your logic, you support France's sovereign right to ban the burqa. That's their sovereign right as a country. And he didn't respond. Of course, he couldn't respond because he would have known that that would be an own goal. By his logic, France would have the right to do that. The hypocrisy of Islamists is astounding. But I think there is a lot of issues in tackling this. There's people like myself and many others, especially people who have fled this. That could be Christians, but it could also be um, people who formerly identified as Muslims and they're now no longer Muslims, and they have been viciously targeted. A female friend of mine has been called, I don't even want to repeat some of the stuff, but the vitriolic abuse she has received from male Muslims over the fact that she's been outspoken on this stuff. It's it's absolutely disgusting. Women especially seem to get the brunt of abuse. Um, but female Islamists can be just as bad. Um, they could be just as fanatical in their views. So we shouldn't assume that this is just a male domain. Although, of course, Islamic societies are extremely patriarchal. Um, Islamism is an ideology that indoctrinates a lot of people. Um, and when I'm thinking of female Islamists, I'm thinking of those who say the West is Islamophobic, or, for example, what France has done with the burqa, and they'll push for these hijab solidarity days. Yet, where's the solidarity for those courageous Iranian women who risk beatings and arrest for removing their hijab? I feel that there really is an obvious problem here, which is that Western pluralistic societies cannot accommodate this ideology. It just can't. Um, Islam's a major world religion, and I think that it wouldn't be realistic to ban Islam. And it would be wrong. I mean, Muslims who are just going about their business, they're ordinary citizens, they're maybe attending mosque, they're celebrating Ramadan, but they're ordinary citizens. They go to football matches, they have office jobs, they're just ordinary people. They're not the problem. However, there is a knee-jerk reaction of a lot of Muslims to say the problem of Islamist extremism has nothing to do with Islam. It's just denialism. That's got nothing to do with us. Now, to me, that's like saying the Christian Crusades of the Middle Ages had nothing to do with Christianity, even though, even though they were directly sanctioned by the papacy. I mean, it's just nonsensical to say that pan-Islamist ideology has nothing to do with Islam. Islamists themselves, of course, absolutely believe that they are true Muslims. Um, but when this is brought up, it's usually just as, oh, they're just nutters, they're terrorists. They don't represent all Muslims. Well, of course they don't, but they are part of Islam. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, failure to be honest about it. It's notable that in all the condemnation of the attacks on Rushdie from leaders, nowhere did any of them say uh, pan Islamist extremism or Islamist extremism. Nowhere. Yet, if there was a far right attack aimed at a minority group, you could be absolutely sure we would be talking about the ideology. The cards of the left, I have to say, um, is obvious. You get someone like James O'Brien who loves to pontificate on his radio show, and he loves to, expose the right wingers in a very smug way. Over time, I've come to sort of see James O'Brien. I'm talking about James O'Brien of LBC as a sort of left wing, almost a left wing Piers Morgan. He's not quite as shouty, and he's a bit more subtle about it, but for example, he was talking about the Rushdie attack, and he was talking about how awful it was and so on. Um, and he had a guest on who was talking about this. I didn't see the segment, but the irony of this is that anyone who speaks about Islamic extremism who happens to be on the centre ground or the right, as O'Brien sees it, he will immediately say it's dog whistle politics, it's Islamophobia. You're stigmatizing all Muslims. So these intellectually dishonest people, like James O'Brien, I think are part of the problem. I remember after Manchester and after the London attacks, there was all these vigils for solidarity, which is fine. I'm not against that in principle. But the mantra is always they won't divide us. Well, of course that's a good mantra because terrorists want to do that. Yeah, I get that. But there is still this idea, oh, but you can't talk about Islam because that would be bigoted. That would be pandering to the far right. To be quite honest, it infuriates me. That mentality that absolutely infuriates me because it is a way of evading the problem. It's a way of saying, well, we'll condemn this. But to be honest, condemning terrorism is the easiest thing in the world to do. Islamists even condemn terrorism. Hizb Tahrir, which is Islamo supremacist organization, they'll condemn terrorism. You know, if there's a suicide bombing, they'll condemn it. They'll say we don't support violence, but they are a supremacist movement. That's a little bit like far right types who will condemn the Norway attack. I remember when Joe Cox was murdered, Britain first condemned it, but that doesn't mean that they are alien from the ideology that caused that attack. Ideology matters. And I think that you cannot tackle a problem without talking about the ideology. And the biggest problem, as I see it, or one of the biggest problems in the West, is we have failed to talk about Islamist extremism. We just talk about this as generic extremism or terrorism. An organization they cope not hate, I have no respect for right now. Why? Because whilst they have a track record of standing up to far right types, they have been shamefully silent on the issue of Islamic extremism. Even though they claim to be a body that is against hate and intolerance, they have failed to tackle one of the most hateful and intolerant ideologies out there. It's an absolute disgrace that a teacher doing his job is forced into hiding in this country. It's a disgrace that when Aisha Bibi, a young woman, a Christian woman who had to flee Pakistan from an enraged mob, she could not be guaranteed safety in the UK. I think in the end she went to the Netherlands. She could not be guaranteed safety in this country. In this country. I think we have to accept that there has to be vetting. It's true that there are homegrown Islamists, like the London bombers, and actually, a number of our attacks haven't been foreign nationals, they've been homegrown Islamists. But I think we also have to accept that there has to be vetting. If people are coming from conservative Islamic countries and they're Muslims, I think it's very reasonable to say, what's your views on blasphemy? Do you think blasphemers should be punished or killed? I think people need to be vetted. And honestly, the left's attitude to this, it's a strange symbiosis because, and it isn't universally across the left, but it's a strange sort of, because you'd think that they're very different ideologies. Islamism is ultra conservative, it's misogynistic, it's homophobic, and leftists supposedly care about opposing all those things. Yet when it comes to Islamism, they quiver, they get frightened. This isn't, I'm not talking about the left in general, but look at Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, for all his supposed anti-fascism work, and for all his speaking out against extremism, not once in his 5 years as leader, so-called leader, did he say the word Islamic extremism. Of course, when there were attacks, he condemned it. But like I say, anyone could do that. So leftists like Jeremy Corbyn will say, "We condemn this terrorist attack. It's terrible. Our thoughts are with the victims, and terrorists won't divide us." Now, if it was a far right attack, he would say, "We need to confront the hateful ideology of white supremacy." Obama, in 8 years as president, had a reluctance to talk about it. Same with Joe Biden. So it's the American left as well. There is this utter failure to talk about the problem. Even some conservatives won't touch it because they don't want to be politically incorrect. But it's a perverse situation that if you're actually condemning the supremacy and the misogyny and the homophobia of Islamism, then you're somehow seen as far right or pandering to the far right. It's a crazy situation. Um, I've tried to be honest. I've tried to be. I mean, I'm not a public figure, so I don't think it's particularly brave of me to say these things. I know if I was a public figure, I would be taking a bit of a risk with this. There'd be a risk from the Islamists who might target me, but there would also be a risk, actually, because this is the thing, speaking out against this ideology carries potential sacrifice. Because of the utter gutlessness that the West has become in many ways, I would have a problem getting elected. because both the Conservatives and Labour would say, oh, well, but there's a problem with Islamophobia here. This guy's, he might be problematic. If I want to get published, that could be a struggle. I could say, but I have absolute solidarity with reformist Muslims, with Muslims who recognize the problem. I've been very outspoken about the way China has treated the Uyghurs. And of course, that's a great irony for all the hate that Islamists level against the West. They don't seem to level the same hatred against China's regime, despite what it's doing to Uyghur Muslims. So there's a obvious lack of consistency there. When Imran Khan, Recep Erdogan, and Malaysia's Mahathir Mohamad demanded blasphemy legislation at UN level, it shows this goes well beyond ground level fanatics. I mean, there's political power involved here. Um, what I want to see is a situation where the West rolls back against us much, much more. Um, I think that we need to be a lot more hardline with Islamists for sure. Hate preachers. In fact, one of my subscribers drew my attention to a Christian speaker. I forget her name now, but she was actually stabbed in Hyde Park last year at Speaker's Corner. This sort of stuff should be attracting the same sort of debate as what has happened over Rushdie. Um, but the bottom line is pan-Islamism is a supremacist, hateful, intolerant, violent ideology, and even the ones who aren't violent, they enable the violence with their views. Um, because if you look at what's going on in Islamic countries, I mean, when the young student Mashal Khan was lynched in Multan in 2017 over alleged blasphemy, people were actually saying it's wrong. He shouldn't have been lynched. If he committed blasphemy, he should have been sentenced in a court and executed instead. That's the moderation. In other words, oh, it's wrong, but only because it was, you know, taken into the public's hand as opposed to being judicially done. Um, how can Western pluralistic societies be compatible with this ideology? It can't. I think that when Islamic leaders insult us, I think we need to push back. I think we need to say and demand, in fact, that they respect our sovereignty. If France wants to ban the burqa, they can criticize it, but they have absolutely no right to then demand that French citizens respect their laws. I just think that there is so much going on that there is still a failure to really, really confront this. And it's this clueless, brainless, knee-jerk reaction. Oh, but you're talking about you're offending a religion. Piers Morgan, by the way, he has he is a complete charlatan as far as I'm concerned because he lacks conviction. I remember Tommy Robinson was on his program. Now, caveat here: I'm not a big fan of Tommy Robinson, but he was, immediately calling Robinson an Islamophobe and how dare you criticize this major religion? I'm thinking, Piers, you absolute hypocrite. You've been saying some very similar things about Islamic extremism. So also beware of these false messengers of standing up to liberal democracy because I think someone like Morgan is a complete. I think he will say anything to anyone. I just don't think he has much conviction. Um, well, we need to support people like Ayan Hirzi Ali, certainly Rushdie, and anyone who's brave enough to speak out against this. I'm not talking about people who are spreading hatred against Muslims. I'm talking about people, especially people who've been through it, like Ali. She knows what she's talking about. Her background is from Somalia. My goodness. If we cannot listen to these people who've actually been through it, we've got a serious problem. Um, and it is so frustrating because these cards who would rather shout Islamophobia. I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about Muslims because there's a denialism aspect going on there. I'm talking about non Muslims who will jump on the bandwagon Oh, but you can't say that it's Islamophobia. They seriously need to grow a backbone. I have no respect for them because what they are doing is they claim that they're all about freedom, they claim they're all about democracy, yet when the opportunity presents itself, they jump on the bandwagon of censorship, they're absolutely pathetic. So, if you agree with me, you have to be prepared to call it what it is: Islamist extremism, Islamist intolerance, Islamist supremacy. And it might run the risk of getting abused from some of these people, but the more people who speak out, the more empowerment there is, the more empowerment for victims of this ideology. But I do think vetting is a big thing. I do feel that right now, Prevent has information on. Well, here's an example actually of. I'm backtracking a little bit here, but here's an example of James O'Brien's absolute hypocrisy. He was lambasting Rishi Sunak for saying that Prevent should be expanded, yet he recognizes that there is a problem with Islamic extremism. So does he not consider that it makes sense for Prevent to be expanded for Islamist hate preacher to hate this country? I think O'Brien's another charlatan when it comes to stuff like this. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, but these are grave issues. I think that we need to be a lot more outspoken. I think we need to be a lot more outspoken in standing up, for example, for Christians who are terrorized by Islamists. And that's not because this country's had a history of Christianity. It's because it's the right thing to do. Just as we've condemned the Chinese government for the way we treat Uyghurs, we need to be a lot more vocal about the likes of Boko Haram and ISIS and their persecution of Christians. And the Foreign Office will have messages on their website about that, but I want to see it at the highest level. I want to see Boris Johnson. I mean, it's unlikely he'll do anything in his last 2 weeks. But when Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, it almost certainly will be her. I'd like to see her speaking out on this stuff. For example, in the Easter message, when she gives a message at Easter, as is a tradition now with prime ministers to give messages at Easter, Ramadan, Chinese New Year. Okay, so when it comes to Easter, I'd like her to say many Christians around the world are persecuted, and the British government stands with them, and we will give refuge where we can to those fleeing persecution. But as for Muslims who are in denial, I think they need to be forcefully challenged. When they say it's got nothing to do with Islam, point out to them that Islamists themselves are forcefully trying to spread the Ummah, that is the global Islamic Caliphate. That is what they're trying to do by their own stated aims. So how can they say it's got nothing to do with Islam? They can argue that that's their interpretation and it differs from ours. But here's the point about Islam: it's a major, major world religion. Just like Christianity has lots of branches and schools of thought, so does Islam. So how can any Muslim say that Islamists have nothing to do with us? What gives them a right to say that there isn't other branches out there that see it differently? Maybe it's not their Islam, maybe it's not the way they see it, but they can't deny that it's there. They just can't. So I think that attitude needs to be challenged because it's an enabling, evasive attitude. Well, actually, it's an evasive attitude. Right, I'm going to wrap this up. But all of these issues have to be considered, and for my part, I will continue speaking out. If some idiot calls me an Islamophobe, I'm going to come down on them like a ton of bricks in defense of myself because it is such a cowardly, wormy, pathetic, evasive way to try and silence debate. If Muslims are victims of an extremist attack like what happened in New Zealand, that might be an example of extreme anti-Muslim bigotry. I do believe that Islamophobia is a term that has been used to stifle debate. I do. And you get the likes of Linda Sarsour in the West who will really, really push it, and then the left jumps on that. It's pathetic.